Welcome to our educational webinar. This is geared towards teaching you everything there is to know about 3D and the best practices on how to create a model and a virtual sample. These are the topics that we're going to be covering today. These are available for download upon request. Simply email webinars@optitex.com if you would like to receive this data. Our current release is version 12.2. If you are signed up for it, you would have received the latest service pack link, which lists all of the things that you can download. You'll notice here on the second screen here, this is where you can download the service pack only or the full version. I would also encourage you to download the sample pack. This contains all of the models plus miscellaneous 3D objects, textures, and our new 3D rigid parts. So make sure to download those, and I'll show you a little later in the webinar exactly how to work with all of those sample files. Also, don't forget that inside PDS you can press F1 to get to our help page. You'll notice under the 3D runway category you can click on Quick Start, which gives you a very basic overview of how to stitch in 3D. So the first step, of course, is to import or create a pattern in OptiTex. And then you need to prepare those 2D patterns to be stitched in 3D. By rotating them to a standing up position, by ignoring the pieces that you do not want to go into the 3D window. After you rotate or flip any piece, you must synchronize it to bring it to its home 3D position. In addition, if you move a file in the 3D window and you've messed it up, you can synchronize it again to go back to its home position. You can also set your piece properties to be a cut to if you're stitching a symmetrical garment. Here are the tools you need to rotate it, clockwise, counterclockwise. You also may need to mirror certain pieces, such as collars and skirt fronts and backs. And you may need to cut pieces in half, such as waistbands and cuffs that are folded over. Also, you need to be working on your sew line, not your cut line, when you're working in 3D. So let's take a look at how that's done. So here we have an original file. I'm going to select all the pieces, press a hotkey to rotate them to standing up. Waistbands and sleeves, I leave them horizontal on the screen. Next, I want to move the pieces as how they're stitched together. This makes it a lot easier when you're stitching the pieces. So here's our back pieces. Here I need to mirror this skirt, and I have to make sure I have all right side pieces or all left side pieces. Here I have a right skirt, so I want to have a right back. So I will set that to back. Here are some of the tiered pieces, and again, I like to just arrange those very much as they're going to stitch on the garment. I'm using my space bar to quickly pick up those pieces. That's a little trick because it helps you pick up smaller pieces. So for example, when you're trying to pick up a smaller piece, you keep getting an internal, just tap the space bar and you'll be okay. So here's a piece that I want to ignore. So in my 3D property window, I will ignore it. And I can also remove it from my desktop. So that's how you can arrange your pieces for 3D. Next, let's talk about how you navigate in the 3D window. This is a nice visual to remind you how to navigate. Let's go ahead and look at what all of these mean. So in my 3D window, if I left click, or the regular left click mouse button, and drag, I can turn her in a circle. If I drag up and down with that same mouse button, I can zoom her in and out. The right mouse button rotates off center, so I'm tilting her. Both buttons move her around in that same space. So I can left click and drag down, and both click and drag down. And now I can zoom up on a particular location, such as her collar. If I press down on the mouse wheel, it will take her back to her home position, which is slightly off center to a 3/4 view. I can also use my mouse wheel, which some people prefer, but I think it's a lot quicker and faster to just learn to drag very quickly in this way. The next step is creating your model. Each of the models that comes in the sample pack contains a set of body morphs. We've placed them in a specific order for a reason, to encourage you to start from basics and work your way down. You will also go back and forth between basics to tweak and perfect that model. So let's go ahead and take a look at the model. I've opened up a different pattern, and let's again look at our model. So on the top of the 3D screen, this is where all of the tools are for working with 3D. I've opened up the model properties, and I can begin by entering in basics the overall slider, which is the underbust. If you don't have the underbust measurement, you can click on the circumference tab and look at the bust measurement. Remember, the bust measurement is cup size only. So I'll go back to basics and adjust the slider, go back to circumference until bust is close. Then when I enter in the bust measurement, it will only change the cup size. So in this way, you can adjust until you have a good model. Now don't forget, there are some specialty poses. Right now I have her in pose 5, which is my favorite because it's just a gentle pose as opposed to the fitting pose. But there's also options to move the arms up and down, bend the elbows, change the pose of the arms and shoulders. You cannot combine poses. If you use one of the set poses, then you cannot use any of the others. Or you can use all of the different arm ones. You'll notice distortion in the model if you do so. There's also specialty bust morphs and specialty face morphs. You'll notice that she has brunette hair. So within the software, you can control in the sample pack, you can drag and drop different hair colors or textures onto the model, even eye color. And you can also open any of these textures in Photoshop so that you could, for example, add pantyhose or change the color of the skin or hair to further customize your model. To finish talking about models, this is a parametric model. She comes with our software. She's balanced, meaning completely symmetrical. Another type of way to get a model into the software is to use a scanner, a body scanner. So here I have a couple examples of other ways to get models in there. Now when you scan in a model, that is a real person. So that model is not symmetrical and not balanced. No human body is. So another option is to scan a model and extract the body measurements off the model and then enter them onto our parametric model. So she'll have hair and skin and everything like this. This white model here, I can actually drag and drop the same hair textures onto because this came from TC Squared, and TC Squared automatically takes the body scan and morphs it to EVA. The model on the right here is a Alvenon model. So this was a model created from Alvanon 3D data, imported into OptiText, and then we added on a texture. Again, these are not parametric models. Now, if you want to try and compare a body scan to a model whose measurements you've entered in the same measurements, you would think, oh, those should be exactly the same. But they absolutely are not, from the reasons I mentioned, where the real body is not symmetrical. However, you can get very close by viewing the front of the model, the side of the model, and the back of the model, and using the appropriate morphs to balance the body. So you can control body depth, body width, even the stomach curvature. Well, that's the pregnancy one. Here's the stomach curvature. Even front rise volume. And so these shapes are quite important to get as close to the model. You can have multiple different types of bodies, and yet they all report back very similar measurements. So it's very important that you build the model accurately if you're doing any kind of a comparison with a body scan. Okay, the next topic is let's get down into best practices for stitching in 3D. So one of the most important things when stitching in 3D is the 3D properties for the piece. And the most important property is the resolution. So here on the left, the resolution is 0.39 inches, and you can see the size of the triangles. On the right, the resolution is 0.2 inches, and you can see that the triangles are a lot smaller. Because they're smaller, you can have much more detailed draping, such as tiny little shearing or little gathers, ruffles, things like this, especially with the collar that's rolling over. If the triangles are too big, then it cannot make all those little delicate folds, and therefore the file will be less accurate. Raising piece resolution also will slow down the draping time, although not a huge amount unless you go to the extreme. So let's take a look at piece resolution. So I'm going to select all of the pieces on this shirt, and I'll do the skirt too, I'll do it all. And I'm going to make them all in the 3D property window 0.47, quite even above the default. Let's ignore the jacket pieces and just bring in the outfit. So here I go. I'm going to drape this file. So now let's lower the resolution down to 0.3. I can even go as far as 0.16 for tinier pieces, or 0.2. If I have quite a large piece that has some small detailing like center front shearing, we have a new feature called stitch resolution. I'm going to change that to 0.1. Now let's refresh and take a look at the spring mode. And notice how the mesh has broken itself even smaller in the shearing area. All the triangles are a lot smaller so that I'll have a more detailed look. So let's go ahead and take a look at that difference. You'll also notice that it's stitching a little bit slower because there's more data there with all of the triangles being smaller. So now you can see this final look has much more nice detail in the shearing center bust area. You can see both that in the spring view and in the real view. And if I press on my high quality render, you're really going to see a much more detailed simulation that looks very realistic. Okay, the next step is let's take a look at all of the 3D tools that are in OptiText. So first, over the 3D window, you have all of your toolbars. There are 3 of them. The advanced toolbar and the 3D flattening toolbar can both be opened by pressing this little dot, little arrow, chevron at the very end, second to last tool. And these arrow boxes here are quick ways to get to views, and then 3 different mesh spring modes. We also have a button here that you click, and that brings up your simulation properties. These are the basic properties of your 3D draping, and it's stored with each pattern that you create. So for example, if I'm working on a bag, I may change my gravity to 0. If I have a particularly complicated pattern, I might check use self-intersection so that it will help with collision. We also have a new feature called use edge-to-edge collisions, which again helps when 2 pieces are coming together with colliding. And then there are some additional advanced. It's not very often that you change your time step or iterations per frame. But what those 2 do is slow down the draping if you lower the number, or speed up the draping if you lower the number. Iterations per frame means when it does 1 pass of draping, how long it will take. Feel free to select either one of those and read the explanation at the bottom of the window. You also have a pull-down menu called 3D. Here you have another way of accessing your simulation properties. You can get to your fabric parameters so that you can edit and add fabrics to your fabric library, and you can get to your plugins. Plugins are used for specialty things with 3D. For example, if you want to import or export with Maya, if you want to import or export import Rhino files, and if you want to enable your high quality render green button found here at the end. The CNext plug loader is a way to do that. If you need to enable your high quality render, go ahead and give support a call, because it requires that you have an NVIDIA graphic card, that you have the latest driver, and that you've installed the Scenic plugin. So these are all the menus for 3D. We also have 3D preferences. So if you select Tools, Preferences, you'll get to the 3D Preferences window. Here you can control your background color, whether or not it loads your last avatar, but more importantly, we have one called Stitches, which is where you can point to your button shapes directory and your segment shapes directory. These 2 directories refer to the 3D objects that you can now add to your file, such as buttons, zipper pulls, zipper teeth, piping, and we will cover more about how to create those and how to use those a little later on. Most of the other preferences are rather self-explanatory. You may find the display preferences interesting because you can put perhaps a grid floor or a center mark down your working space, and again, this is particularly helpful if you're working with backpacks or bags, things that are non-apparel, and you have no model in the window. Another very important factor is your fabric library. The fabrics that come with the system are more than enough to work in 3D. You can pick a fabric that's closest to the fabric you want, and you can change anything about it, such as increasing the bend so that the fabric will be stiffer, decreasing the stretch so it'll be stretchier by lowering the number, or changing the fabric weight. Often that's the only information you can get from your fabric other than its content. Here's an image of our fabric testing machine where we can test fabrics for customers at a cost, and you can add that to your library. Okay, let's review what we've been through so far when it comes to models. I've already gone over your parametric models. Again, you need to build one that is both correct in overall shape and in dimensions. You can also bring in scanned models. These are static, meaning they're not parametric, meaning you can't change their measurements. And I also went over how you can drag and drop different textures on your model to recolor her hair or skin or even add stockings. In our latest sample pack, we will include a few more textures for you to use with the models. All right, so this is one of the most important pages in my presentation today because these are the rules for stitching. When I do customer support and work with some of the large and small companies that are implementing OptiTex, they will send me their initial 3D files so that I can check them and perfect them, and you can also learn from that how to make a more perfect 3D file. So let's begin. There are 6 ways to stitch, and I've listed them here. There are 2 ways to delete a stitch, and here are the must-do stitch techniques. So let's go through them. First of all, there are 6 ways to stitch, and this can cut the time it takes you to stitch something significantly if you're stitching smart and you're following these different ways. Okay, so the first way to stitch is segment to segment. I'm going to go ahead and delete all these stitches. And let's hide the model. And let's hide the 3D property window so we can see. The first way to stitch, and notice how I right-clicked and opened my 3D toolbar, which is the same one over her head, so that I can hide her and have more room. The first rule, of course, is to arrange your pieces as they're going to be sewn. If your pieces are arranged like this, it's not so easy to sew them. So arrange them as they're going to be sewn. Remember, you have to have all rights or all lefts on a symmetrical file such as this one. And if you have a sleeve, and I think there's a cuff here too. There we go. A note of thumb is arrange the sleeve so that the front part of the sleeve is oriented with the front part of the shirt, like this. Not like this. Not flipped over. Like that. Or flipped over like that, so the front is on the wrong side. Now when it comes time to stitch, first way of stitching. The first way is I can make a box around both stitches and only those grade points. If I were to extend the box over to here, that would be wrong. I have to just surround those grade points, and it makes 2 stitches. So let's delete that. The second way to stitch is point to point. That's when you have notches or multiple grade points. So maybe I find it hard to make a stitch on a particular file. So I'll click point to point. I'll start on the first point and end on the last point. Then I have a little number 2 by my my little sewing machine. So I will do the second point it's supposed to stitch to. The third way to stitch is right-clicking. Now what does that mean? That means that maybe I've deleted a stitch, just one stitch. So now this stitch is sitting unconnected. Well, I can click on my sewing machine and right-click on that stitch, and it picks it back up again, and then I can continue sewing. The fourth way to stitch is segment to segment. Oh, I said that wrong, didn't I? So segment to segment was the first way. I already showed you the rectangle way. So segment to segment is if you click on a line, it'll add a stitch up to those 2 grade points, and then I can go over and click on that next line. You saw me create a rectangle around both side seams to create that stitch, but I can also just put it around one piece, one stitch, and it will put a single stitch there. And then I can click to make that final stitch combination, which is the single stitch rectangle. And then the 6th way to stitch is really nice, and that is if you want to go counterclockwise, which you totally can do. So I'm going to select these two stitches with the box and delete them. I'm going to create my first stitch. Now I'm going to create my second stitch, but I'm going counterclockwise. Well, then I just shift click and it'll allow me to go counterclockwise. Now there's one other nice technique, and that is if you do not know the length of a line. So let's say I have this waistband here. I'm going to delete that point. I want to create my first stitch here, but I don't know where it should go. I don't know where the same length is. So I can click on the point and then click on the line. I'm going counterclockwise, so I'm going to shift click on the line. And OptiText will complete the line the same length and add a grade point there for you. It saves you a lot of time when you're trying to stitch. I'm going to go to Tools, Preferences, and under 3D Stitches, the first choice there is create a grading point at the end of the second stitch segment. This must be checked, or OptiText will create the same stitch line, but it won't put a grade point. Deleting stitches. If you click on a stitch and press delete, it will delete that stitch. It will not delete its pair. I would press delete a second time to delete the pair. The second way to delete is I make a box selection around that stitch. Then when I press delete, it will delete both stitches at the same time. All right, let's go back to our best practices for stitching. So again, arrange pieces in 2D to make it easy and fast. Control click on an internal, then stitch. Let me show you what that means. If you have an internal line on a piece, let's say it's a pocket. I think I have something here. So this is an internal line on the pocket. I'd like to stitch on it. These endpoints should be connected when you're stitching in 3D. They should not be not connected. I'm going to select on that endpoint and press enter, and I can confirm that it's connected. If it was not connected, I would press Shift-E to connect it. Now I'm ready to stitch. Well, if I click on that point and click on that point, it made the stitch around the outside. That's not what I wanted. If I control click on the internal line first with my stitch tool, then it will definitely stitch that internal line. So control click to stitch an internal line. Okay. One thing is very important is to stitch every line, even if it's a hem or a collar or a sleeveless shirt edge, because just by placing a stitch, you've added force on that end as if it was seam finished. If you do not place a stitch there, you can't control, it will just stretch and move like the fabric, and therefore it won't look right. So I've seen some basic muslin patterns stitched together by some of our university students, and around the neck and the waist and the armhole, it looks a little wavy and it doesn't look right. When I looked at the pattern, I could see that they had put no stitches there. So that's quite important. Okay. So to place single stitches, you simply click on the line and right click off. Click on the line or button and right click off. I could even make a box and right click off. So there I put a single stitch on those hems and on that center front. Now this skirt front is a cut 2. So I know that after I place that single stitch there, I need it to sew to itself. So I will select on that single stitch and check symmetric in my 3D property stitch window. Next, when you're creating your stitch parameters and shaders, save time by selecting all the stitches and putting in all their widths, maybe deselecting buttons or invisible stitches, and then immediately make a shader for those stitches. This way you don't have to constantly be shift clicking through all your stitches just to add different textures, colors, shaders, or change their 3D stitch properties. Okay. So when I'm ready to add stitches to my shirt, let's go ahead and open up the 3D window so we can see. First, I will select all my stitches, and then I may go in and deselect by holding the shift key down the buttons, because they're going to be different. And if there's any other stitch I don't want, I can just go ahead and shift click on those stitches to deselect them. Then I go immediately to my shader window, open my shader manager, create a new stitch shader and assign it. There, I've just grouped all those stitches together. So from then on, those stitches are deselected, that's okay. I can go right to my shader, and I can go up here and click this button, Select Assigned, and it will select all those stitches. So if I want to go into the 3D property window and change their stitch width, I can. Let's make them 0.12. Then I can go to my shader and maybe add a texture to that. So in our sample library, I'm just going to add a double needle. Then I can go to my variant. Variant is where you add your colorways and logos. Article is where you add your colorways and logos, and variant is where you add your texture. So I can go to my colorways and logos, and I can color those stitches. Now I don't have to do select assigned when I'm working with the shader. If I change the color of the shader, every stitch is going to change automatically. I only need to do select assigned if I want to see which stitches are in that group, and if I want to go into the 3D stitch property window and change something. Now I have a 3D rigid piping around the collar, so I'm going to create a new shader and assign it just for that stitch, so it doesn't have the double needle on it. Okay. Next, you don't have to worry if a stitch is flipped unless it's layering on layering pieces. So don't worry about flipping stitches on just regular, your base pattern, because they'll never be flipped. Now, if you do have pieces that are layered, such as this collar layered on top of the shirt, then what I did was I made the shirt layer 1, the collar base layer 2, and the upper collar layer 3. It also helps to increase the thickness of an upper piece, because if it's too thin, it's much easier to collide. So layer and thickness will help with collision, meaning you can see the layer beneath through the collar and it doesn't look very good. Okay. Now we have 3 more options: shader fix to hold pieces or internals, multiple stitch rules, and use stitch resolution. I already went over use stitch resolution for smaller details, where I can change my stitch resolution. The default is 0, but if you change it to 0.1, then it will create a more fine mesh on that stitch. Multiple stitch rules apply here on this skirt. So when you have double stitches on top of each other, I'm going to select all and delete. Here are the rules. I know that this pocket is going to overlap and stitch here. I cannot create this little stitch here and then create a stitch that overlaps that little stitch and make it much longer, like here. The software will let me do it, but you will receive an error when you try to place it in the 3D window, most often. So that's breaking the rules. So instead, I place my first single stitch, and that's layered, so it's flipped. Then I can do my next stitch. Notice I have this yoke stitch stitched to here. Now I'm going to stitch this piece to here. Now I can stitch this to here, and then I can stitch this to here. So that's legal. I have this stitch that's overlapping with this stitch, and this stitch. A last specialty function is that you can take an area of a pattern or a section of a pattern and use a feature we called shader fix to hold that piece absolutely still. So for example, if I were to draw a small little shape here on the center front, then use build zone and built a zone inside that little piece. Then in the zone window, I type in shader fix, capital S, capital F, all one word. And I think I forgot to sew my side seam back together. Let me just do that real quick. Okay, and look, a new stitch. I can go right into shader, manager, click on the stitch I want it to have, and click assign. Okay. So now I'm going to recycle. And you'll see that this waistband piece, wherever I place it, it's not going to move that little section, that center front section. So I better put it right against the body and right on the location where I want it to stay. And in fact, I think I will ignore the shirt and just do the skirt. Now, I'm going to place these exactly where I want them. I'll even go in the body a little bit. You know, by the way, I'm using the same 3D rules as right click, left click, both click, but when I'm moving pieces, I press the control key down. And they better touch too. So let's click simulate. And look how that isn't moving at all. And you can see that it's supposed to sit lower down on the hip, so that's kind of messing it up because I have it too high. Okay. So let's move on. Again, take a print screen of this. I will be emailing out a copy of this at the end, but this is very key. Most common mistakes are by not following the rules here in 3D stitching. And there's your 3D stitching guide. Now, 3D properties. How do we use our 3D properties? So you have piece 3D properties and you have stitch 3D properties. So let's go ahead and take a look at these 3D properties. So the first thing you do is you select all your pieces and you go into your 3D property window. Let's minimize everything so you can see. First we have global. That's just which size you want to drape. The base size always has a star next to it. The second is display and lock. These are pieces that you do not want to go into the 3D window. So you select those pieces and check ignore. Next is positioning. So again, you can be very quick about this. You select all the pieces that go in the front and you choose front. You select all the pieces that go in the back and you choose back. Then you have your collar base. I like to flip my top collar over and select it as a collar base as well and put it on a separate layer to get a more pressed crease. If you want more of a rolled collar, then you would choose collar instead of collar base. I would choose my sleeve, and that would be my left arm. Left arm low is for a two-piece suit, two-piece sleeve, where the under part would be the left arm low. And then of course we have top, bottom, left, right. So I'll select all those first. Then I multi-select and I can choose that I want them to be slightly cylinder around the body and what percentage. That way I don't have to keep typing the percentage and selecting cylinder on every single piece. Next, I choose my resolution. Don't forget we also have layer. Closest to the body is 1. Symmetry is for something like this front placket that overlaps itself. You should choose whether it should be above or below its pair. It is not to be confused with layers. I wouldn't choose this collar and make it above, although that's what happened. It doesn't, it can be aligned. A new feature you're not familiar with is constant deformation. What constant deformation does is it will not change the shape much from its original position. So if you have it curved slightly, it'll kind of stay curved. This was popular with bags, but it can also be used in apparel. So let's say I want my collar to really stay rounded. If I make the constant deformation 100, it's not going to move far from its original position. So let's recycle and see the original position of the collar. Now it's going to be pulled by the under collar, but it's going to try to keep that very round shape. I also find it works really well on hoods. When you're trying to get a hood to fall on the head and sit there, I'll give it a shape closest to the shape I want it to be cylinder-wise and give it 100% constant deformation. So it will not fall out of that original position. Okay. You can also group pieces by giving them a group name. So if I had a piece that had tons of little pieces, you know, like a shirt, patchwork shirt, or, you know, lots of seaming on the back, so there's like 6 pieces across the back I have to arrange. If I arrange them on my screen nicely, like this jacket here, I'll arrange them all kind of close to each other. And this has a very complicated thing going on here. So I can sort of arrange them all nice. I can choose that they are, left side pieces, but then I'll give them a group name. I'll call them ruffle or pleat. So now when I place those pieces in the 3D window, notice I was doing all that work while it's draping. Don't hesitate to multitask instead of waiting. You'll notice, let's go ahead and hide her and move the sleeve out of the way. You'll notice all those little pleaties are moving together as one. So that's what a group name does. Okay. And then, of course, we have our fabric properties. Here you have bending, which is drapey, the drapiness of it, X and Y stretch, shear, which is bias stretch, friction, which is how slippery it is, fabric thickness, again, that's best for layered pieces, and fabric weight. Now keep in mind, bend, the higher the number, the stiffer the material. Stretch, the lower the number, the stretchier the material. And shear is the same way. So the next property is your fabric properties. Pressure is very, very sensitive. So if you ever want to use pressure for any reason to puff something out like a down jacket, go very low, like 0.001. Very, very, very small. And then lastly, we have our texture attributes. Now, what this is for is if I use one shader on all these pieces and yet my sleeve is facing the other way, I can tell the sleeve only that, it should have a flipped angle of like 90 degrees. Then I don't have to create a separate shader for it. And it can also let you preset a position. So for example, you can always have a fabric come in offset a certain way whenever you select it, and that's stored on the piece itself. Okay, let's look at our stitch properties. So first you have your stitch width, which is the width that it appears in 3D. Then you have your stitch resolution, which is that new feature that allows you to have just a section have tinier mesh, such as the center front shearing. Then you have your segment shape. Now this is where you can select from a list of 3D parts that come with it, an actual 3D shape, such as a metal zipper or piping. You can also design your own in 2D. So I've done that on the collar. I've selected a piping on the collar. I can even control whether the piping cuts off at the end or turns into the fabric. So let's see what that piping looks like. So here it's almost done stitching. While that's finished, you can also select on a stitch property a button stitch. And in the 3D, you get your button shapes. And again, we've given you a whole list of different buttons ranging from 4, 8, 12, all the way up to 20 millimeter button sizes, 4-hole or 2-hole, zipper pulls, rivets, eyelets, buckles, rings. All of these things will enhance that 3D file. Okay, so let's go ahead and let that finish. So here is piping placed around the collar edge. And we have different size piping. And here we have an actual 3D button. As you can see, it's not just a picture of a button, it's an actual button. So let's go back to finishing going through our 3D properties. That was your segment shape. Then we also have a stitch group. So if you have a series of segment shapes, like that piping has to go across multiple pieces, then you can group them so they blend together. You also have offset, and that's the distance that the object will appear from the material. Usually that's quite small. Folded allows you to add a crease, like think of the center front pant crease, where you want it to, when it's done draping, maintain a crisp crease there, like on this dart. You know, flipped, that's of course if you stitch something on a layer, often it will flip the stitch, so you need to unflip it. Symmetric is when you want something to sew to itself, such as the center front of the skirt or such as the buttons. I want this button to button, so I check symmetric. Use thickness is a special feature we have. If you have something like a pocket or an internal piece and you want it to appear much thicker there, then you would select on that stitch and check use thickness. We also have our stitch parameters. Edge force will pull that edge away. So if you have a strap on a dress, you put an edge force, it'll pull it. The back of a bathing suit bottom, where you want it to, pull nicely around the body. Stitch constant is the stiffness of the stitch. If you don't want that stitch to stretch at all, you can make that 1,000, or I think in apparel, usually around 200. Shrinkage is if it's elastic. So you would type in a shrinkage here and it would gather it in. Fold angle is when you want it to sort of, after it's done draping, try and get to that angle. Again, this seems to be more appropriate for bags or backpacks. But if I were to take 90 degrees here, then it would try to maintain a 90-degree angle when it's done draping. Then we have the special fold line. Fold line is a way for you to position your pieces before you start draping, to get them around the model. Maybe you want to, add a fold line on a lapel so it rolls back, or a cuff so it rolls up. And of course you can control the direction, the angle, and whether it's folding on the cylinder or the body. A good example of it folding on the body is if the model's arm is bent and you want the sleeve to bend around that arm. Okay. So those were the 3D properties. Now let's talk about analyzing a file that you draped in 3D. If there are weird wrinkles or a bad fit, always go back and make sure your model is correct, your piece resolution is small enough, and you've chosen the appropriate fabric. Also, some of the stitch parameters and piece parameters that we went through will also affect this, such as making a pattern on a layer 2 or layer 3 a different resolution and even a different thickness to avoid collision. A good rule of thumb for a 3D piece position is to place the pieces very close to where they end up. So you notice I put a slight curve in all my pieces. I move them close to the body, right where I want them. If you move them far away from the body, and let's just do that. Okay, so watch when I move these pieces far away from the body. Now the file is still going to drape, and it's still going to be quite close to if it wasn't far away from the body, but you'll see what you're asking the computer to do. Okay, so now I'm going to hit simulate, and you'll notice it's accelerating towards the body now. It's even going to start rising up the body a little bit. If you press the green simulation button to stop, you've just calmed it down. And then when you press again, it will now be a more gentle stitching. But you're asking it to do a lot more work. Look, it even didn't make it around the arm. So if you have the pieces all nicely curved, close to the body, even inside the body, that's okay, it'll work itself back out. Make sure that none of the stitches go on the outside of the arm. Now, one thing I forgot to tell you, you'll notice I'm moving just one piece of a symmetrical file. How am I doing that? Well, I can break that relationship by clicking on the 3D manual move tools. And if I click on a piece and move it, I've just broken the relationship so I can move them separately. If I want the relationship back, all I have to do is click on the piece, go to 3D property window and hit synchronize. Then they're back to moving together. So here's my fronts and they're moving together. But on my model with the pose, I need to separate them. So I'll go to move piece, move one piece, and now I can go back to my regular both click, both click to rotate, left click. And don't forget I have my control key pressed down the whole time. So rule of thumb, place pieces close to where you want them. And then let's go drape this now. And I'm going to simulate it. And once it kind of gets close to the body and starts to rise up, if it starts to rise up too much because of the acceleration, I can stop it and then I can start it again. And that will sort of put the brakes on and let it finish the draping quite gently. Okay. Here's a screenshot of some of the different types of rigid parts. Oops, come back. Here we have our 3D props, and they can be buttons and segments. Buttons are, like I said, buttons, buckles, zipper pulls, rivets, knobs, little hook, hood stops, and segments are piping. You can actually draw a tiny little circle in OptiTex, save it as a PDF file, copy it into your segment folder, and make your own piping. I've done that with pin tucking. I've done that with a little scalloped edge, so you can really go crazy. And then we've also given you some zipper teeth and different 3D stitches. We've been working with Rhino to create those 3D objects and import them into OptiTex. And we import them in as a Rhino format. Now let's finish up talking about our shader and shader manager. So, the best way to use the shader manager and the shader is open up your shader and make sure to dock it with all your other toolbars. But then keep your shader manager next door. I'm going to just create a new file, and I'm going to create a new piece. Notice my shader menus are empty. I'm going to create a piece, and the software will automatically make a shader for that piece with a little asterisk. If I make a 3D stitch, the software will automatically make a stitch shader with an asterisk. And if I make a 3D button, it will automatically make a button shader. So you have your piece shader, your stitch shader, and your button shader. The idea is if I have, of course, multiple pieces, I'm going to, in my variant, which is where you add your textures, I'm going to select a texture from our library. Now let me turn on in my view window my pattern shaders in 2D so I don't have to put it in the 3D window to see them. And you notice I had a default shader, so it automatically goes on any piece that I make. If I want one of these pieces to have a logo, but not the others, then I will click on Article, and I can add a logo. But it's going to add that logo on all three pieces. So instead, I'll go back to Variant, select the piece that gets the logo. I'm going to use the tools above my shaders, and I'm going to select Duplicate and then Assign. So now I have one shader for these pieces and one shader for the piece that's going to get the logo. Articles are for colorways and logos. In Variant, I can't add a second texture. In Article, I can. So now I can go in and add some logo. And it's only going to show up on that piece. If I want this piece to have its own unique texture, I can just select New Shader and Assign. And now I can give this piece its own texture. To control anything about the shaders you've added, you go into the shader window, and here you can control offset, angle, whether it should flip, whether it should scale, if you want it to be transparent or shiny. In Article, you can control adding multiple logos and layers, and you would have to choose on the logo or the shape or the base texture when you want to work with it, with the scaling and maybe making it a different color. Same rules apply for stitches. When you're working with stitches, again, you can select multiple stitches, create a new shader and assign it. From then on, whenever you change that texture on that stitch, it's going to change it on all stitches. So the shader window is a very convenient way to group pieces, group stitches, and be able to just change them once. What's nice about that is you don't have to ever again shift click on a bunch of different pieces, because you can just choose the shader they all share and click the button in shader, select assigned. And it will select all the pieces that are assigned that shader. For further information on shaders, please go to our help website, Shader Manager, and there's another video there, plus a detailed explanation of all the tools. Okay. There are different types of 3D files that you can stitch, everywhere from shirts to pants to bathing suits to combinations. If you look at the Optitex sample pack, we have pretty much an example of each of these types. So I encourage you to open those up and look at their settings if you're ever struggling on what settings to use. Now I want to show you some of the examples of stitching, and we're using high quality render. With high quality render, it really takes it up a notch to look much more realistic. Here I hid the model, did a high resolution snapshot, and brought it in to make a combination file. Okay, so let's finish up by looking at the shaders. Okay, to enable shaders, you have to have an NVIDIA graphic card, I think of a series 560 or 600 or later, NVIDIA. You need to go to 3D plugins and check Scene Loader. Check on that, then close or open the software to load it. And then this little green high quality render button should turn on. The way that it works is you can just click on it, and it's going to add a secondary level of light to that file. Even look at the button, nice and shadowy and pretty. But we also have given you a collection of different shader textures. So let's go through some of them. Here's a canvas shader. So if you look, it gives it this texture. Here's a more soft canvas shader. We also have an interesting knit, several knit shaders, leather shaders. So this skirt has a leather shader on it. Let me turn off the high quality render and then turn it back on. Oh, I don't have a leather shader on there, pardon me, let me do that. There, so that looks much more realistic when the high quality is off or on. I'll go through a few more of the shaders. We have one called Satin, which gives it a nice satiny look. And we have a few outrageous ones, I guess just to show off. One's gold. And then we have an interesting one which will turn it back into line art. And there's many more. One of the interesting ones is if you have a logo on a piece, you can choose logo shine and it will make the logo shiny. You know, like on those cool printed sweatshirts and t-shirts. Once you have a nice high quality render turned on, you can hide or show the model. And you can take a high quality picture of it by clicking the snapshot button, and you can raise the resolution and save the file. Well, I gave you a very nice overview of all of the different tools you can use to use the Optitex 3D accurately, efficiently, to get the best results. So good luck with 3D, and don't forget to email support.usa@optitex.com for any additional help. Thank you.